Good morning and welcome back to the Hidebound Convivium. As of the time of recording this video, it is currently May 6th, and I hope to have this video up by the end of the day, but circumstances being as they may, we'll see how that goes. And this is going to be sort of a short video, just sort of discussing my work, what I've been up to lately, and how I think you guys can help. So, if you've been following the channel, recently I put up a video, I believe it was last week, on the topic of science fiction and eschatology. And that's really been sort of a focal point for me lately, just given changes, intellectual changes in my life, and pragmatic changes in my life, right? So I recently got married, and in doing so, I've sort of started to disengage myself from pretty much all kinds of online social media, and that includes the engagement I used to have in reactionary communities online. I still want to have a contribution to sort of my side or my tribe in the culture war, so to speak. But as other people have so eloquently pointed out, primarily at this point, the problems that we face are not political so much as cultural or intellectual. And that's prompted me to do a lot of soul searching into what I actually want to spend my time doing. And I found that, I'm a writer by trade, and I really want to hone my craft, and I want to be. And frankly, these past couple months have been probably the most productive months for me as a writer, even as I'm finishing up my coursework and I finished my senior thesis, which I'll talk about in a second. But what I realized in these last couple of months and a lot of the work that I've been turning out is that essentially in fighting this culture war between sort of the forces of reaction or tradition or counter progressive forces, let's just call them, and cultural forces of progressivism on the other side, I've realized that narrative fiction, because we live in a sort of media driven, story driven society. Well, all human societies have been story driven, but our particular time period, I think more so. Because of the time period that we live in and the centrality of narrative fiction to shaping culture, I found that was the best ratio I could get of time spent to productive energy. And what I further figured out, I think, is that in talking about culture, a lot of times what you're talking about is ends. You're talking about the ultimate purpose of things and the ultimate fulfillment of things. And as I say in my essay, that's eschatology. It's sort of a branch of theology, and I think that in spite of some very intriguing, some very incisive and well written examples or counterexamples of the phenomenon that I'm going to describe, in general, Christians or people of a more traditional, worldview have sort of surrendered a lot of ground in science fiction to people who don't share our worldview, to people who have a more atheistic or non-teleological worldview. So I wrote my senior thesis on the science fiction of Jack Vance. And Jack Vance, I love him as a writer, right? But you can see and this is especially apparent in his Dying Earth stories, you can see that he has a specifically anti-teleological worldview, and his characters and stories and worlds are meant to reflect a kind of cultural relativity, a kind of cyclical or nonsensical in some sense, yes, but also purposeless nature of human existence, of human civilization. And I mean, that's fascinating on one hand, and he's a really great writer. But on the other hand, you realize it sort of prompted me to realize how a lot of the greats of science fiction, I should say, so like Asimov is a clear example because he not only did Asimov write a very important science fiction trilogy, Foundation, which is basically like the basis for the grand space opera science fiction story. Um, but he was also, militantly engaged in missionary activities for atheism and socialism, basically. So, and a lot of the greats of science fiction, um, while they might not have been as militant as Asimov, kind of had the same sorts of background presuppositions. A couple of um, the sort of uh, what am I can't find the word. What am I trying to say? Oh yes, um, some authors I would exempt from this, right? Rightly or wrongly. I think of Ray Bradbury in Fahrenheit 451 because one of the major plot points of that book is sort of the preservation of old knowledge, or one of the major themes, I should say, is the preservation of old knowledge, anti-consumerism, and the main character, right? He's remembering part of the Bible, or not the main character, um, I don't know. It's been a while since I've read that book, but I remember remembering snippets of the Bible was one of the major little plot points. Um, at any rate, and then you have other works like I just got finished reading Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, which I very much enjoyed, and I do plan on making a review. Someone in my comment section recommended it to me, so I've read it. I've liked it. I will probably talk about it, although I do want to read the book of the new is it the Book of the New Earth that's the supplement, because I'm still a little confused, and I'm told that a lot of stuff is wrapped up. That's sort of like a wrap up, extra work on the side. And then also, famously, right, is Canticle for Leibowitz, the cover of which I put on the thumbnail of the video on science fiction, Christianity, and eschatology. But anyway, I'm beating around the bush a little bit, but my main point is that science fiction and fantasy to a lesser extent, obviously J.R.R. Tolkien is able to smuggle is not even really the right word, just manifest a lot of Christian themes in fantasy. But I've always been more of a science fiction guy, I guess, and even when I write fantasy, it tends into science fiction. Um, so, the reason I find science fiction so important as a medium, right, is because I'm going to sound really pretentious here, but there was a literary critic called Darko Suvin who wrote a very influential book on the metamorphosis of science fiction, and he said essentially that what science fiction is it's a genre of fiction that is defined by I use the term epistemic distance. He uses the term, I believe, empirical, like new empirical device. But basically, science fiction is defined by a kind of novum. There is a change that is made in the world that allows for a new empirical, with an E, empirical situation to arise that the author can then explore. And now Suvin was a Marxist, and he thought that good science fiction should always be on the cutting edge of social vanguardism and progress or whatever. But I think this is very important because, um, you know, in our current fog of ignorance, right? What we have science fiction doing is sort of peeling back veils of ignorance that we have and saying this is what the world looks like on the other side. This is why I think it feeds heavily into the phenomenon of science fiction manifesting into science fact. There's a reason why people thought that flying cars were going to exist round about now or sometime in the near future, even though flying cars are a very impractical thing if you think about it. Like, what happens if you have a traffic jam in the sky? What happens if two people crash into each other at 30,000 feet? Do people have to have a pilot's license and a driver's license, et cetera, et cetera? So if you think about it logically, it doesn't make very much sense. But so many science fiction writers put this in their story, and it deeply influenced the way people thought about the future. There's a reason why we have this whole concept of um, futures past, for example, and we have all of this like retro futurism nostalgia, which is part of like what makes the Fallout series interesting to people, for example. This is just a well-known part of the history of fiction in the 20th century and the 21st century, and sort of it kind of dovetails very nicely with this concept of hauntology that I think people on the right are pretty familiar with. Excuse me, I'm drinking a cup of tea. Anyway, um, I am really beating around the bush, but what I'm trying to say is, what I'm trying to summarize basically is that I think science fiction has a very unique place in the 20th and 21st century in as a culture making force, specifically because of this, as Suvin says, this ability to put ourselves in a new empirical environment. And I realized in my Christianity and eschatology and science fiction essay that what we have is we have a fundamentally materialist reductionist worldview that most educated people either accept blindly or they're catechized into, or whatever the case may be. And it's extremely limiting when you really think about it, especially in terms of science fiction. But it is the default lens that science fiction lends itself towards. And you see this reflected in the fact that in a lot of science fiction, not all obviously, and a lot of science fiction is more closely focused on the hero's journey and sort of Jungian archetypes, things like that. Like Star Wars is what I'm trying to say. But even in the Star Wars setting, okay, the Jedi have the Force, but what is the Force? Like, what is when you really watch Star Wars, you don't get a sense of what the wider metaphysic of the setting is, right? That the Force is some kind of psychic, maybe religious energy that these gurus, these Jedi can tap into, but we don't get an ultimate sense of what is everything trending towards. Whether that's fictional or like within the context of the setting, whether that's actually going to happen or whether that's apocryphal, and you transist the or yes. What is the word I'm looking for? Not transist. It's you compare. That's what I'm trying to say. You compare and contrast. That sort of science fiction, where you've got this surface level fight. You've got good and evil wizards with laser swords. They fight on spaceships, and you want the good guy to win because he's nice and he's just a farm boy from Tatooine or whatever, and he's his friends are nice and they stand up for truth, justice, and the American way in space. And that's all great, but then you peel that back, and what is there? There's nothing, right? And if you look at like the expanded universe, or also the nerd stuff around Star Wars, the history of the Star Wars setting has gone on for like such a very long time. Of course, I'm talking about like extra canonical stuff, and you get the sense of like, where is it all going? Where is it all headed to? In the Christian story, we have a totalizing history, a totalizing metaphysic. We can account for where we came from, where we are, where we're going, and that gives us the ability to take all of the history of everything and condense it down into a narrative point. And you don't get that in other science fiction stories, you just get this is a random disconnected piece of detritus of storytelling from this far off place that's very interesting, and or not, as it may be. And even the device that Star Wars uses, where they just say this happened long ago in a galaxy far, far away. What does that tell us about anything? So basically, what you've just said is all this happens, in a, you might as well have said this happened in a parallel universe. This happened in an alternate dimension. This has, and you might as well have said this has no bearing on any of the wider questions that you might have about the world, and that's fine. That's fine. I'm not accusing Star Wars of being intellectually lowbrow or anything like that. I'm not berating Star Wars. I'm just saying it's not a philosophical work. It's not like it's not a worldview piece. And what I think the culture needs right now is worldview pieces. So I contrast Star Wars with something like the Book of the New Sun, where it's made very clear from the start what people's expectations are for the eschaton. And in that case, it is literally the eschaton. It's literally the end of time. And that suits Wolf's, narrative purpose because it's a dying Earth story. But it doesn't have to be, like in Star Wars, we don't get this sense of what is the end game of the story. Which is why it can just be resurrected for zombie trilogies ad infinitum. So yeah, this sense of eschaton or purpose or intention is something that when you really apply it to science fiction, I think generates a worldview type of work that has very potent, if you write it well, has very potent cultural connotations. Because I think fiction, narrative fiction, is a way to shape people's ideas about things. And what I point out in the Christianity, science fiction, and eschatology thesis, and going round and round to my point, is essentially that what we have in Christianity and trying to square Christianity with the sort of scientific picture of the world is we don't actually have any doubts. It's like, I point out in the paper, it's like scientists think that the world will end, or the universe will end in heat death, and and bits of matter will pull themselves apart to the quarks. And it's like, okay, well, what does that say about anything, right? Scientists, not just scientists, any normal person will also say that the Mississippi flows into the Gulf of Mexico. But God himself, if he was to come down, could just make it flow backwards. He's God. That's what he does. And we have this sort of intrinsic, or not, this implicit understanding of the world as this mechanistic clockmaker's universe that's sort of left over from the Enlightenment, I think. And we have a real fear of, and trust me, it can be done wrongly, but we have this real fear of manifesting grace in the real world in our stories. And this can be done really well. Like I think Wolf does this remarkably well. That's why I'm really glad I read the Book of the New Sun before I started making this video and wrote that essay, because I think it's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. But I think, we can take the difficulties that we have with squaring the faith with what we know about the world, and what we do is we take those difficulties and we use those to generate the novum, to generate the new story or the new empirical circumstances, and we explore it. Because really what we have as Christians is not a lack of it's not a lack of desire to influence the culture. It's not a lack of talent, even maybe, but I think sometimes it's a lack of imagination. And in my case, really, it's a kind of fear of people thinking less of you, thinking that you're lowbrow, thinking that you are not sophisticated, because you have this desire to tell these stories that manifest in a kind of direct way the grace of God in human life. And this is not something, right, like people would have been embarrassed of even maybe 200 years ago. But in our modern kind of context, we want, even in our fiction, even in these made up stories that we write to sort of tell ourselves what we believe about the world, we even then are compartmentalizing our faith. And I don't think that's healthy. And I think my goal, in some sense, is to be a small part of a renaissance in Christian culture making that is sort of unabashedly Christian, but at the same time, at the same time, tells an interesting story, because you can't just beat people over the head with Jesus talk in a fictional story and it'd be interesting. And part of that is just because that's not really how grace works. I think it's not really how God works or how religion, rightly speaking, works. Um, you know, you can't. It's hard. Like, for example, you don't want to have a character. Say I'm Catholic, right? I don't want to have a character walk into a Catholic church and receive communion and then like be, I don't know, strengthened in his valor or something like that, because it would just be a little bit too on the nose, and it's treating divine grace like a vending machine, or like a casino, like a slot machine. But again, I'm digressing. All I mean to say is that there's a right and a wrong way to introduce Christian themes into fiction, specifically science fiction. Some people have made the leap. Right, Wolf does it. Miller does it in Canticle, and I'm sure that some people have done it poorly. I haven't read those people, right? Because why would I? Um, so that sort of brings me to my project that I'm working on right now. So I initially envisioned what I'm working on right now is as a short story collection. I think what it's gonna end up being is a collection of about 12 short stories that, when stitched together, will form a coherent narrative. But the stories in and of themselves are self-contained stories. They have their own narrative arc, so it's not like a chapter in a book. And at the moment, I am pretty close to completing the third of these short stories. And what they do is they wrestle with this question of, say, men go to other star systems and they spread out, along the stars. How does belief in the Christian God, for example, or how does the church hierarchy, for example, or how does mankind's spirituality in general adapt to these new circumstances, and what kinds of new opportunities does this change of locale open up for the activity of the activity of divine grace in human life? And that's sort of a through line or a sub theme of the work. So the premise is that at some point in the distant past, in the setting, human beings came to a new star system. They built an artificial world, a very large artificial world, sort of a reverse Dyson sphere, that's hollow in the middle. And after malaise, civilizational malaise, or whatever the case may be. They leave, they go back to Earth, and they leave the remnant left on the planet just sort of struggling with the fact that they've introduced all of these strange genetically modified plant and animal species into the biosphere, of the sort of fake biosphere. They also have to maintain the fake biosphere. And the machines that mankind has used heretofore to sort of to accomplish all of this, to accomplish these feats of elaborate scale. I won't spoil too much, but essentially they come to be utilized in surprising ways by unexpected persons, so to speak. But it's an interesting setting, I think, that I've been working on for like a few months now. And I posted the first two stories on my Substack, although I haven't done a read through and put them on my channel, because at this point I think it would be too long. But what I'm going to get to the chase now. It's 26 minutes. Finally, I'm getting to my point. So if you like rambling, this is the video for you. Anyway, what I'm looking for really is I'm just looking for feedback and for essentially test readers. I don't publish the stories until they're done. So that sort of solves my problem of I have this constant writer editoritis where I just go back and edit the same passages over again, and I don't actually finish what I'm doing, which has been very helpful moving to this sort of like short story chain format. I've been getting a lot more done, but it also will avoid my temptation to just write half of a draft and then send it to somebody and be like, look, what do you think about this? But at the same time, I really do appreciate sort of critical feedback because, I have certain blind spots as a writer, and I don't know necessarily what people want to read. I know what I want to write, but I don't know necessarily what people want to read, and that's important, right? Because you can't generate culture, meaning, and infuse that into the culture if people just don't want to read what you've written. That being said, I also I want this to be a kind of nexus for storytelling, and for the sort of cultural renaissance that I hope to promote in online reactionary circles. I don't frequent like online chat rooms anymore. I don't really engage in social media, so my entire engagement with the online world is just my YouTube channel and my Substack. So, for those interested in that sort of project, really all you need to do is go over to the newsletter, read whatever is the most recent story, right, and just leave feedback. And my overall intention, right, is once I've completed the whole collection, once I've gotten the feedback that I want, and I've made the necessary edits, I will probably release or self-publish in an electronic format the edited manuscript. And I think sort of the online self-publishing route is a good way for this sort of work to get off the ground. In order for us to have a cultural movement on the right, we just need to do it. We just need to buckle down, and we just need to write. And in my case, right, if you're talking about prose fiction, we just need to write and keep producing things, and not, most importantly, I think, not let sort of inane online drivel and the news cycle and shit posting distract us from like really important work. This is to borrow the cringy talk of the Marxists, right? This is our praxis. Um, so that being said, right, what I'm basically doing is just soliciting test readers who can, um, you know, who can in their spare time just provide feedback, because I get some reads and that's great, but what I'm really looking for is just, did you like it? Did you not like it? What are some points of improvement, for example? Because that's really helpful as a writer, because writing is kind of like public speaking in the sense of you kind of have to, it's like you almost have to, when you're learning public speaking, you have to like tape yourself and watch yourself giving talks before you really know what you're doing, I think. So it's sort of like that. And, on a final note, right, I don't want to steal all the limelight. First of all, I don't even write under my own name, so it's hard to steal the limelight. But I have no intention of like being a world famous author. I don't even necessarily, it would be good enough for me if just I could promulgate some some first rate science fiction that people in our community can enjoy reading, and that strengthens them in their faith and commitment, and really sort of sparks their imagination, so to speak. Because I think that the world of the imagination and the world of creativity is extremely important, especially I think for people who have the kind of naturally conservative disposition that I think myself and probably a great deal of my audience has. Um, so, I don't intend it to just be myself. And if someone is interested in sort of joining their horse to mine, or even just submitting work to be published alongside mine on the newsletter, that's perfectly fine. And I obviously, full credit would be given, and you know, I, I want people to be able to find other people's work just as easily as they find mine. So, if in the coming months, right, people are interested in sort of forming a community of writers around the Hidebound Press, that would be tremendous. I think that would be a tremendous contribution. It would be a much greater contribution than sort of endless cycles of shit posting. That now that I've extricated myself from for a few months, I've realized it really just it's hard to underestimate just how more productive it makes you to sort of swear off shit posting. So if you're one of those people, I really recommend it. At any rate, I think this is going on too long. I just want to say thank you guys for tuning in, and if you've tuned in until the end, I'm really surprised, um, and thank you. I'm I'm honored that you've heard me ramble for so long. But at any rate, guys, this has been the Hidebound Convivium. I hope to hear from you again soon. God bless, and have a good rest of the day.